Welcome to our week 2 of Sport for Development. Last week, as you navigated through the Sakai page, you were introduced to a broad-based introduction, history, transformation of the sector of sport for development within the context of the broad role of the United Nations and the development initiatives undertaken by that global organization, as well as within the context of sport. And there were lots of great examples of how sport has been used to address social issues and change the lives of thousands and thousands of children, either through education, AIDS, HIV, by assisting youth to overcome conflict between different religious groups, to address gender inequality, to empower women and girls, to provide frameworks so youth stay in school and they don't drop out. So there's really these numerous number of issues that have been tackled and used sport as a key mechanism. So it's interesting. Fred Coulter, a great scholar, very prolific in the area of sport for development, early on sought to differentiate between plus sport and sport plus. Because a lot of people, I think, generally speaking, and maybe you before you read the information from last week, thought that sport for development was athlete development, where you have sport, which is commonly associated with being a really wonderful environment for young people to learn teamwork, leadership, communication, physical activity, lifestyle approaches, guidance from coaches. And all of that is great, and sports certainly is well known for that. But that would really be considered a sport development program, and what Coulter would call sport plus. So sport is the main goal of that activity, essentially to enhance athletic performance. And you might learn some of these other really great aspects of sport in terms of teamwork and communication. What we're talking about here is sport for development. So the key social issue, the development challenge, whether it's economic, social, justice, women's health, reproductive health, education, all of these, the environment, which we'll talk about in this lecture today, all of these social issues. The idea is that you have a program to address a social issue and you use sport as a mechanism to actually make that happen. So there you have plus sport. So the plus is the program designed to address the issue, and sport is kind of the add-on. And Coulter was kind of funny. He said, that sport's being used as a magnet, to draw in the kids, and then we're, inoculating them again, for a vaccine, or we're having a play day at a school, so then the kids can be tested because they know they have really high attendance. And he really pushed the discipline. This would have been probably about 12 years ago, to move far beyond these superficial avenues of using sport as a magnet to really be entrenched within a broader framework for development. So as you looked at the pathway and architecture of the United Nations and the various incremental steps that they took along the way in terms of integrating sport into the broader framework for development that are underpin essentially programs at the United Nations, they began to recognize how sport can be used in a refugee camp environment, not only as, and certainly, children in a refugee camp to play soccer, to play rugby and have that sort of suspension of everyday life and a little bit of fun, potentially bring the parents out to watch, what they found was that the whole culture of the camps began to evolve and change, and it became more of a community that as parents came out to watch, they developed friendships, and out of that became opportunities to talk about governance and social justice, and of course these are people who are literally undergoing the worst challenges of their entire life. And I think when I was a child, and maybe this was a misconception, was that people would go after an earthquake or a natural disaster or a war-torn country, and they would go into a refugee camp, and they might be there for a number of months or years. But because of the migration, the climate change problems, the war, I mean the Syrian war, I mean we're still in Afghanistan as nations trying to overcome the Taliban in those war-torn countries. We're seeing children that literally grow up in a refugee camp. So how is it that we use sport to in some way, shape, or form enhance the lives of those children, but also as a teaching mechanism? So just a couple of stories. So we sort of see sport as a little bit of a panacea, right? And sport can solve the world's problems, and it's going to be that secret solution, that we're going to pump into all of these problems that we have around the world to bring about fundamental changes. And certainly I don't want you to step away from that idealism, because that's what keeps me going. Right, I've been studying sport for development for probably 16 years now, and I've seen incredible growth in the discipline. When I first started studying this, there weren't even peer-reviewed articles. I had to look to practitioners' reports and year-end reports to find out what was going on in sport for development. And I think there was just one website that had information, and today we have thousands of organizations, delivering programs to tens of thousands of children. However, are all of these programs guided by the fundamental principles of development that we have learned from failed development? So how do we make sure that sport for development is not just a panacea? How do we make sure that we're not making the mistakes of development that have been made since World War II, when they first established the goals from the developed countries to assist the developing countries, and certainly people were well-meaning, but the programs were misguided. So in a minute I'll go in a little bit more detail, but this is a book written by William Easterly. So Dr. Easterly is a professor at New York University, or he was. Hopefully he's retired now. But for 30 years, he worked for the World Bank. So the World Bank is essentially the bank for development. So in Canada, we have the Canadian International Development Agency, and if they had an idea for a development project in Canada overseas, then they could go to the World Bank with their proposal and receive funds for that. And of course, these are all linked in to the United Nations, and again, this might be a multi-country effort towards this development project. But in the book, Easterly talks about projects that cost like $500 million, and he would have been the one that did the sign-off. All right, he's the one spending that money. So after doing the job for 30 years, he said, I'm going to go take a look at those projects that I funded, right? I've given out how many millions, billions of dollars to these projects in the developing world. Let me go and actually take a look. And so the book is really well written. It always seems to start off with him in a Jeep on a bumpy road, or a bus bus in an overcrowded city, and here he's going off on an adventure to find this development project that he funded. So one of them was a dam. Okay, so we're going to build this dam. We're going to, capture the water and build a hydroelectric facility associated with that, and we're going to use clean energy to power these cities in the developing world, which means that we can build that industrial infrastructure for manufacturing plants, for whatever it is, farming equipment, cars, automobiles, computers, what have you. So sounds like a good plan, right? So Easterly goes to look up this, spent $500 million on this dam for this hydroelectric plant, and it's doing nothing. It's rusted. It doesn't work at all. It's more of like a white elephant that's just sitting there holding back a river that potentially is causing other environmental issues beyond that. And what he began to realize was these macro projects that were funded with billions of dollars from the World Bank often failed. Okay, so the fallback was that after those from the global north, right, the developing countries, once they left, had they built local knowledge to manage that plant, to maintain that plant, to then move forward with the economic development proposals using the hydroelectric energy that they were building, right? So it was all of those other steps that needed to be part of the plan. The plan does not stop once you've built the plant. That's like maybe step 1 of 20 in terms of bringing about sustained economic development. Another project that was funded by CETA and the World Bank was in Nigeria and Africa. And of course, it's been in the news a lot lately. And they've essentially had the Biafran War in the 1960s, when the oil-rich area of Nigeria wanted to secede from the country. And there was basically a religious territory that had the oil, and a really horrible war ensued from that, and that particular area of Africa was not able to succeed. But the point was that they were very oil rich. They had all this money. They had every leading Shell, Mobil, Exxon, all the oil companies are there. They're siphoning out all this oil. The company's making, billions of dollars in oil, but what are they going to do with it? So there was a military leader. He killed the guy before him, right? So, you kind of think, oh, not a nice guy. And essentially the country is run by the military and by this dictator. But the dictator had actually had a vision for the country to take the oil money and infuse it slowly into the economy. And what they wanted to do was do this through the public sector. So the public sector would be the military, the police, universities, hospitals, schools. So, anybody that works for the government. And what they were going to do was incrementally increase all of the wages of the public sector people, with the idea that it would be, they would have increased spending and discretionary income, and then that money would then be diffused through the grassroots level of the economy, right? So not like a big power plant idea, but more of a grassroots idea. So a team of Canadians was very involved in that program for about 7 years. So all the work gets done, and they actually created a business school at the local university that would take on the work that had been done, essentially in payroll benefits and human resource management, so they could continue to expand the payroll increases beyond the public sector after that initial stage was done. But unfortunately, as soon as the Canadians left, there was a huge amount of pressure from people saying, why are university professors paid more than school teachers? And so instead of sort of being reconciled that this is slowly going to be implemented to the benefit of all, there was a lot of bickering over the amount of money that people received within their pay increases, and the fact that it was only public sector people that received the funds, and they were very upset with the pace. All right, so they wanted to see more money now. So between all of those factors, the entire thing, it was called the Udoji Commission, completely disintegrated, and there was almost a civil war, another civil war in Nigeria as a result of this. So it's, once again, maybe you've got your MBA school, but what could have been done to prepare people for a broader understanding of what the nature of the project was going to be, and the importance of the implementation within a timely and equitable fashion across different disciplines, and then hopefully outside of the public sector as well. So those are just two examples of development gone seriously wrong. And then we also see other examples of, aid after a catastrophe. So I think if we look at Haiti, after the earthquake, we saw millions and millions of dollars, flowing into Haiti. But what they did was they said, those poor people, let's send food. Right? And I won't spend a lot of time talking about this, but what about all the people that were actually growing food or making bread and selling that, or part of they had a store, they were part of a local infrastructure, around feeding the country, and then all of a sudden you fly in all this free food, and all these people that had an income and a small business, all of it's gone. Right? So even aid after catastrophes has to be seen as something that's really short term, and then we need long-term development. So when we look at sport for development, we're not going to make the same mistakes. Right now, I'm going to take a couple of minutes and take you through the panaceas of development that were highlighted by Easterly. And this is so that when you design your own sport for development program as your major project at the end of the term, that you won't make these mistakes, and that as you digest the information in this course, and we talk about it when we meet on Teams, that you'll have this fundamental insight that I think many people in the area of development would say that overall development has failed. That we have not seen the changes in the developing world that we would have and should have seen given the amount of investment. So what went wrong? Well, William Easterly calls these panaceas of development. I like to call this lecture, this presentation, Mythbusters. And that's, years ago they had the TV show with Jamie Heineman and Adam Savage, where they would, go ahead and do all these really crazy experiments and blow up cement trucks and what have you. And, they say, is this myth, is this true or is this not true, right? So what we're going to do is look at the 6 major panaceas identified by Easterly, and he goes on to explain why we really thought that these were going to be the answers to development, but they weren't. They actually, in some cases, caused way more problems. So the first one is aid, just giving financial aid as an investment in countries to invest in various areas of development. So it might be the economy, it might be health, it might be education, it might be technology, whatever it is. And so we saw organizations like the World Bank and others, CETA in Canada, investing or essentially setting up a loan for millions and millions of dollars for these different aid and development projects. So Easterly did a study, and of the 88 countries that he looked at, and of course there's a multitude of other countries, but only 17 of the 88 countries actually had a positive outcome from the funds that they received from the aid. Okay, so from the money that they were given. And so the question was, why? And this is a key that is a main takeaway from this entire course. So a fundamental element of development is that you need to have incentives. Okay, so in order for people to carry out whatever it is that you're wanting them to do, you need to structure a set of incentives to keep them engaged in the project and to make sure that they realize that they have a vested interest in the outcome of the project. So if they think, I'm just getting all this money, right? They don't see maybe that next step that might be available to them if they buy into the project, if they work hard, if they stay with the project, if they try to innovate in and around that, if they maintain the overall guidelines that were first instituted as part of the aid package that they would have received. So without having clear incentives to guide the actual implementation of the designed aid project, they largely failed. The second panacea is, and I almost really feel funny saying this as an educator, but it's education. And I think if you actually have done this, usually when I'm in a classroom with students and I say, what can we do to save the world? What development projects are going to work? Lots of hands will go up and say, people in these developing countries need more education. So why is that a panacea? Why does Easterly say that education is not the key to development? So when he was in his, Land Rover, going through these jungle roads off to these schools, that they would have built, through Africa or South America or whatever, and he would get to the school and there would be very few children in school, and students didn't graduate from school. And even in countries, so Brock has a program now with the Canada Caribbean Institute, the graduation rates in Caribbean countries is, around 60%. So, the kids drop out. Okay, so they've got schools. So, what are the issues and challenges? Why is it that the kids aren't staying in school? So, Mr. Easterly would get out, walk around the town and talk to people and ask, why aren't your kids in school? And some parents would say, well, why do they need an education? There's no jobs for them here. Or they might say, I have a farm. I need, as soon as my, sons or daughters turn X age, I need them to be working on the farm for me. Or I have a store. I need them working in my store. And so for parents, they didn't see that broader benefit of education. And you can see that if you live in a rural town that's isolated from a city where there might be a broader job market, then why would you be really pushing your kids to finish high school when there may not be, the outcome of that is really no different if you pulled them out when they were 14 years old and had them working on the farm. Right? So the idea is that in order for parents, and again to go back to that notion of being incentivized to keep their kids in school, there need to be jobs. You need to be able to show them the outcomes. If your child stays in school until X age, this will be the outcome. And in the time that I've spent with the Canada Caribbean Agency in different Caribbean countries, we see that, and we see parents pulling them out for the kids to work. And when we were there, one of our goals was to really try to instill this stay in school message in the kids. But even the kids were like, they had no hope of going to post-secondary education because they had no money. And some of the islands were really small. The only jobs available to them might be tourism related. And then they didn't have any type of tourism program in the curriculum in the school. So, here's these kids that might be able to get a job at a hotel or a restaurant or a travel agency or maybe doing some type of excursions. But, they weren't taught the fundamental business skills in order order to do that, and or the hospitality program, something that we might teach at Niagara College, right? So you graduate from that with really, really hard skills, and you can walk into Niagara's tourism industry. So, a significant limitation there in terms of the real benefits of education. The third panacea is, I think, maybe somewhat humorously by Easterly called cash for condoms. And this is the notion that if we can control population growth in the developing world, that we can overcome the challenges of poverty. Right? So there's too many people, we can't feed them all. There aren't enough jobs for all of them. We can't send them all to school. We can't provide health care. We can't vaccinate, right? So it's just this view that population is this, really critical issue, and that if we just gave everybody a condom, right, or lots of condoms, and curb the population growth, that we could overcome some of these other economic and social health and education challenges that these people are experiencing. But what Easterly found out was that there's actually no relationship between population growth and individual household income. Okay, so the two of them have been sort of artificially linked together when that's not necessarily the case. So, when he actually looked at population into the developing world, he actually found that it did fall between the 1960s and the 1990s. Now, not significantly, it was 0.5%, but when you're thinking about millions of people, that would be a considerable number. But what he found was that the issues were more related to the economy and the fact that the parents didn't have any skills to use within the context of a burgeoning economic system, and because of that, they're home and they're having more kids. Okay, so when I was 12, 13 years old, I lived in Nigeria, and families there, they had 7, 8, 9 kids, and they didn't use any type of birth control. But for these families and the individuals, families were everything. Children were treasured, and children. I'm not saying that the parents did put them into local schools, and local schools might be under a tree, and then as students aged, they had more formal education, in proper school, what we would consider to be proper school environments. And there, I don't want to project my view of what a school is and say that that's what a school in Nigeria has to look like. But they did have schools for the older students to attend. But again, it was back to this notion that without a strong economy with innovation, entrepreneurship, small businesses, loans for small businesses, that there weren't opportunities for people to have jobs and then focus on those jobs instead of maybe having families. All right, so number 4, let's loan them the money. So we've given them the money in the form of aid, and it hasn't worked. And so what we're going to do is get the wealthier North American companies or the global North to provide loans to the global South, for them to achieve whatever their development goals are. So what happens when you have a loan? You have to pay interest on that loan. Right? So imagine if you have not, a loan that you're going to have one day, a mortgage to buy a house that might be a few $100,000, but here you're getting a loan for like $1 billion or $500 million to undertake whatever project it is. And again, a little bit of skepticism here on how well thought out those projects were in terms of being incentivized for all the people who were involved in the project to really engage over the long term. So what happened was, what we did was further impoverish the global south because they're indebted to the global north. And so that some countries couldn't even pay off the interest payments, let alone the capital for the loans that they received. Really, and I genuinely think that, I don't think that the global north meant to further impoverish the people in these developing countries by providing them with loans. I think that they thought, well, we're overcoming, any stereotypes that might be associated with, giving aid. But of course, the loans could not be paid back. The countries were spending more money paying back the interest on the loans than they were actually developing the projects, the development projects that they had originally requested the loans for. Number 5 is loan forgiveness. So by the 1990s, they realized that these countries were becoming further impoverished because of the debt payments. And they essentially were overwhelmed by the debt payments and were never really going to be able to pay them back. So there was a huge outcry. So one of the people who was probably, I think in my view, one of the most memorable individuals who was a real advocate for loan forgiveness was Bono. And he went to politicians, he was on the news, he was on late night, at all of the concerts. Everywhere he went, he was bringing out this huge momentum to forgive the loans to the global south. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a quote to you, so you can get a sense of why forgiving the loans was not the answer. Debt forgiveness grants aids to those recipients who have best proven their ability to misuse that aid. Debt relief is futile for countries with unchanged government behavior. The same mismanagement of funds that caused the huge debt will prevent the aid sent through debt relief from reaching the truly poor people. So Easterly talks, that quote mentions governments. When you think about the corruption of certain governments, military governments, the lack of accountability of governments, we could really go on and on and on, right? So there was a story. So I was able to travel to Nepal. I think young people go on that year of backpacking, and they had a royal family that essentially, ran the country of Nepal at the time, and they had received billions of dollars from the World Bank to improve the lifestyles of the individuals who lived in Nepal. And they banked it all. It went into Swiss bank accounts. So when I was in Nepal, there was a huge amount of political unrest. There were curfews. We could hear gunfights in the streets at night. There was a communist party that was trying to take over the royal family. So it was a bit of a scary time. And then about 4 or 5 years after that, they essentially went in and slaughtered the entire royal family. They just shot them all. Okay, so they were tired of this governance, right, by a non-elected body who essentially were taking the money from the UN, who probably shouldn't have given it to them, right? Like Easterly, big regrets, right, about spending all that money, and then knowing that the money is actually being filtered off into private coffers. So, we can't go through the number of countries where we've seen this happen, but certainly corruption and bribery are not, they're issues that are of considerable concern when you are providing aid or loans. So the 6th panacea that was identified was technology. And again, you might think, technology is going to solve all the problems. And I think, that's in our world, right? In the global north, when, we can get a new iPad that, is like a supercomputer used to be when I was a kid, right? And for us, technology, and certainly as a student and Sakai and Teams, and even since COVID, right? We've essentially, our economy and our education system, I mean, everything has been saved by technology. Even the vaccine used technologies that had never ever been used before, and that was part of the reason they could develop them so quickly. So, technology within a developed nation does have the potential to be a real catalyst for growth and innovation and small business, and economic growth among those 85% of the small business companies that are really drivers for Canada's economy. But what's the issue in the global south? Okay, the first one is that oftentimes some of the technology that's given to these countries, it's already obsolete by the time they get it. All right, so maybe the companies, maybe they're donating the computers or the technology or whatever it is, and it's something that they've used and they don't need it anymore because something newer, well, we're just going to give that to the global south, which is obviously inappropriate. If we don't want them doing that. A key one is that I think any technology, people have to learn that. Right? Even, I'll just admit it. Every time I get my iPhone, it's like, okay, how do I, adapt to all of the new features? And if I get bought a new iMac this summer, take a couple of days to navigate your way through the technology. And that's after, essentially growing up with technology as you have done. So imagine people that have never had computers before, they've never had cell phones before, they haven't used Excel or any of the other programs that are kind of like second nature to us, and then you're having to educate all of those people to use that technology. And then the question is, what is the incentive if they do learn it? Right? So if you do provide them with the technology, the software, the hardware, you need to provide them with the incentives, which are guaranteed employment at a living wage. Right? So all of those things need to be in place. Otherwise, people who are maybe not going to struggle through that process of learning the technology. And the third one, and we see this has been a struggle in the developing world too, does technology take jobs away? Valued jobs. So, sort of interesting, right? Go to the grocery store and you can go to your own teller, right? And you can check out all your own groceries. And, maybe it's faster, maybe it's not, what have you. But I always think, I'm taking a job away from someone who might have been working for, Sobeys or Zayres or, the Superstore or what have you, for years and years. And if we all use that, are they going to get rid of the tellers? Right? And I think we could speak to numerous types of industries that look at automobile plants, right? So, today it's all robots that are building those cars, okay? It's not the Model Ts that went down the assembly line, with men and women who were putting those cars together. At the end of the day, there's actually a story about, it was a development grant where they built a bakery. Okay, so I guess they had enough wheat and grain or whatever to make bread, and they thought, let's build a bakery, in this town. And so they built the bakery, and it put all the local bakers out of work, right? So, you really have to think about, what is the purpose of this technology? Is it really going to help, or is it going to undermine a local economy? Okay, so these are the panaceas, and as you go through looking at development more broadly, and we'll continue to talk about that, but as you think about sport for development, remember these panaceas. Remember that sport isn't a panacea, education isn't, technology isn't, aid isn't, forgiving loans, loans in and of themselves. None of these things on their own are going to address the substantial problem of development and challenge and poverty and AIDS and disease that we have in the global south. And I would say in Canada, certainly in our First Nations as well. And hopefully we'll see a lot more changes there from our all levels of government. But remember that even sport, even though we speak very highly of it, and it is a key tool in development, it's not a panacea to bring about the substantial change that we actually need to bring about a new world and a new future in the lives of the people who need it the most.